This video is for students who are looking to improve their historical writing about a document's reliability. There is a separate video available that provides a model of how to use the sourcing and reliability tool, but what I'm going to focus on in this one is how you can then apply the insight you gained from that tool into a very well-written explanation about the degree to which the source is reliable. For the purpose of this video, I will be using sources from Day 11 of Unit 4 in the United States History curriculum, which is about the changing roles and status of women as a result of World War I. The lesson begins with a secondary source text and a video that provide a general overview and historical context of how World War I impacted American women. Then we'll look at three primary source images related to this, and we'll assess the reliability of each. We'll end by applying what we learned to construct a response to this prompt, where we will determine the extent to which the information presented in all three of those documents support each other, and in doing so, we will be looking at the reliability of each one. So, like I mentioned a moment ago, the content for this lesson focuses on how the roles and status of women were impacted by World War I. I know we're focusing mostly on the skills here, but if you are viewing this video for guidance with an activity that is not from Day 11 of Unit 4, it probably makes sense for you to read this secondary source, Women in World War I, so you can follow along because you'll see as I'm doing my modeling how important historical context is when discussing reliability. This reading is taken from a chapter in American Yawp titled World War I and Its Aftermath. American Yawp is a free online textbook, so you can definitely find this passage there. It's only 4 paragraphs long, and it begins with the sentence, "Women reacted to the war preparations." So you should be able to find it. Regardless of where you're reading it though, whether it's in these slides or on the American Yawp site, pause this video here while you do that. All right, now that secondary source is read, let's check our understanding before moving forward. For this first question about how World War I affected the roles of women, I found that women joined both military and civilian organizations, such as the Army, Navy, and Red Cross, as doctors, nurses, and office workers. However, they faced both physical and mental abuse, and on top of that, many women of color also faced racial discrimination. Which leads us to our next question about whether the roles of women changed regardless of race or class. And unfortunately, the answer is an overwhelming no. And I included some of the direct quotes from the text that really support my claim. This last question asks me to make an educated prediction of the extent to which these changes were permanent. And unfortunately, I worry that after the war ends, many of these opportunities for women will disappear. However, I'm sure it did demonstrate the dedication, work ethic, and abilities of women. The reason why I want to include this in a video about using the sourcing and reliability tool is because you have to know something about the event in order to put the sources that we're going to look at into context. With that, let's move on to those 3 primary sources we're going to evaluate and use in our argument. I'm going to model the first one and do a think aloud as I go through the process. Then you'll do the next 2 on your own. So let's take a look at the first one. And remember, the full title of this tool is the Sourcing and Reliability Tool. So make sure we also look at the sourcing information as well, which I usually do first. And we can see the title and caption right here, the title being Cheerfully Doing the Work Required, as well as the year. Unfortunately, I couldn't find much more than that, and I did go to the New York Public Library site where this image came from, and all I can find is that it was copyrighted by the press service, which makes me believe this might have been publicized by the US government. Now, as I consider its reliability, I really need to be thinking about these questions, which are basically taken from that sourcing and reliability tool, and I'm going to record my answers here on this slide. Well, for the perspective, I did go on that New York Public Library page, and I did find the photographer's name, which was Miller Kelly, and that it was copyrighted by the press service, but I couldn't find any additional information about either. And unfortunately, this is something that historians come across all the time. It is pretty common for a person or publisher's name to be lost, and the best we can do is to make sure we consider this when assessing its reliability. Even though we don't have this information, we can still use other clues to determine their likely purpose. For instance, this image clearly shows a woman of color smiling at a tannery, and the caption informs us that she did this willingly to contribute to the war effort, or at least according to the person that wrote that caption. Therefore, whoever took this photograph and published it likely wanted to show the positive contributions of women, and maybe women of color in particular. If this was published by the government, was it propaganda to strengthen a sense of patriotism or nationalism? Or maybe it was used as an advertisement to get others to work or volunteer. While we don't know this for certain, These are some possible options that we should be considering. Now let's think about bias. My big question is this photograph propaganda? Her smile and the title implies that she is happily doing this work for the war effort, but does this accurately reflect the experiences of women of color? Based on what I learned from the text and video from earlier, I know that women, especially women of color, definitely faced racism, prejudice, and abuse. Now, I don't know if this woman in particular faced any of these, but we do know that many women did. If this source is only informing us of one version of events, that's usually a red flag for bias. And lastly, we have audience, and I can infer that this was for Americans to see during World War I. The next step is for us to take these findings and actually use them to make and defend the claim about its reliability. On the Regents exam, reliability is determined by how accurate and useful the information found in a source is for a specific purpose. Well, our purpose is given right here, for providing evidence about the role of women during World War I. So knowing that, I need to be thinking about which of those 4 reliability factors that I just worked with are going to help me do this. I'm going to start with its usefulness, and to help me, I'm going to flip back to the notes I just took, and my intention is drawn here to its purpose. Because I think it was published by the government during a war, as well as its title, I worry that this might be propaganda, which may limit its usefulness. However, it does show a woman of color contributing to the war effort, so it is useful as evidence of that. So I'm going to go ahead and classify it as moderately useful. Regarding this second question about its accuracy, I'm again going to flip back to my graphic organizer, and this time I think I'm going to consider its bias. If this was propaganda, obviously it's going to try and persuade us into believing something by only telling us one side of the story. As I mentioned earlier, I know from the readings from previous in this lesson of the obstacles and abuse faced by women who volunteered and worked during World War I, but this is definitely trying to put a literal happy face on it. I have very serious concerns about the accuracy of this source, which led me to write this. The last thing to do is to combine both of these ideas and make one statement regarding its reliability. Well, based on what I wrote for both its accuracy and usefulness, I don't think that this source is very, very reliable, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't use it. After all, this woman was smiling while doing the work during World War I. However, and you can see that I wrote here, we should go out of our way to find additional sources that will ensure we do get a fuller, more accurate idea of what was going on at the time. At this point, you should pause the video and repeat this process for these next 2 sources, this photograph and this poster. Now that you've assessed the reliability of all 3 sources, let's incorporate this hard work into our writing, and I think this prompt here is a great opportunity to do this. Basically, it's asking you to rank the reliability of each against each other and select the one that you believe is the most reliable. Depending on your results, you may have found that they are all reliable, or they're all unreliable, or they're kind of all over the place. Regardless, you need to compare them against each other and then make a clear claim as to which is most reliable. You may even want to go back and read the final evaluation you wrote for each one to help inform your decision. And you also need to include your reasoning. Something you can do to really strengthen your claim is, after you explain your selection, you should point out not only your choice's strengths, but also why the other 2 are less reliable. As you do this, though, you are not simply repeating what you wrote in each of those individual reliability analyses. You should really be trying to tie all of it together into a brand new argument. And my advice would be for you to pick one of those 4 factors that you use: point of view, bias, audience, and purpose, and find one that was relevant to your assessment of all 3 sources. Here are some sentence starters that illustrate what I mean. For instance, let's say bias was a big factor in all 3. And if it was, focus your argument on that and explain how that when looking through this lens of bias, you found this in this source, but this other thing in that source. Then tie it all together by explaining how this justifies your selection as to which is the most reliable. When you're all done with this, you're going to see this task asking if these sources provide similar or different information to interpret historical events during World War I. And if they are different, how do we know which is a more reliable source and we should rely on more to learn about this? Well, after you make your claim, and I'm going to put up this right up here, after you make your claim as to whether they're similar or different, you absolutely want to use your findings about the reliability of each to defend your claim.